guest with whom we're going to discuss what are the limits of Trump power and what can be the challenges that he might face in his internal politics, but also in his foreign policy. So let me introduce our guest. This is David Herszenhorn from Politico. It's Alexandra Vacroux from the Davis Center of Harvard University and Jeffrey Malkoff from a Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My first question to you, if we take internal American politics, what can be the factors that can influence Trump's decisions right now? Alexandra, what do you think?
Well, we do have three branches of government, and Trump is only the executive branch. So we're counting on the fact that there's a legislature and a judicial branch, and that the checks and balances in the Constitution are going to come into play if ever he oversteps his authority. We're already seeing that happen a little bit on the immigration order, with the courts putting a stay on that. And we're wondering if Congress is going to react to some of his orders that will eventually probably usurp congressional power.
Can we just elaborate on this? Jeffrey, maybe a question to you. We have seen the decision of the federal judge, or the ruling that suspends the Trump's order. Do you think basically that the court system can be a real challenge for his power?
I mean, it can, yes, that's its role. The American constitutional system is set up in such a way that there's this process of judicial review where courts have the right to determine the legality, the constitutionality of executive acts and actually of laws. And so if the district court upholds the preliminary injunction that was granted suspending the ruling, and then if that can then be appealed, and if the subsequent courts of appeal up to the Supreme Court potentially continue ruling in the same way, then yes, they can prevent Trump from implementing the order.
David, but how Trump can react on that? For example, he can fire judges, or he can go to the Supreme Court. What is his powers?
Well, in the case of the immigration ban, yes, the expectation is that he appeals to the Supreme Court. But as we know, the court is divided right now because they're missing a judge. He cannot fire judges. What he has been doing is going on Twitter and insulting judges, which many people think may not help him later because, of course, the judicial branch takes very seriously the fact that it is an independent, co-equal, as we say, branch of government. In the Congress, which I used to cover, they're very proud of the fact that in the United States Constitution, the Congress is Article 1. The president is not the first article of the Constitution. So even though Congress is controlled by Trump's fellow Republicans, these branches of government do see themselves as equal and as powerful as the president and prepared to check his power. We saw this with Obama too, some of whose executive orders were thrown out by the courts.
Let's come back to the Congress because I would just like to finish with the courts. So basically, how do you estimate the situation when the federal judge just suspends the decision of executive order of the president? Does it mean that basically in US you have the rule of law and the judges have so much power, or there is politics inside?
It's rule of law, and the judges have such power. The judges really pride themselves on being apolitical. One of the things that's interesting is that the judges, both in the lower court and in the appeals court, include judges that are appointed by Republicans. Many of them are considered judges, which is to say extremely respected judges who rule entirely on the merits of a case without concern for political opinions of their own or of the people presenting the cases.
Jeffrey, do you think, well, if we take the Republican point of view, do you think that Republicans themselves should limit Trump's power right now?
There's always a tension between the executive and the legislative branch, regardless of which party controls both of those branches. Right now, I think that most of the congressional Republicans have been willing to go along with Trump because it's early in his administration. They're waiting to see what he does. And he's not become a political drag on them. Where I think you're going to see more pushback from Republicans in Congress is if Trump is doing things or is pushing for legislation that is unpopular and that threatens their ability to get reelected the next time that they come up for election.
David, but coming back to Congress and what Jeffrey is saying, we still have, we see the opponents of Trump among the Republicans. We know McCain, we know Graham, we know McConnell. What is his position? Because he was criticizing Trump's saying on Russia. So what do you think? What is the power of Congress to limit it?
Well, Congress can legislate. If it decides, for example, there's some work going on right now in Congress to explore what legislative steps could be taken in the event that Trump moves to lift sanctions against Russia. Mitch McConnell, the majority leader in the Senate, has actually been very careful. He was much more careful during the campaign compared to some of his colleagues to avoid criticizing any of the candidates. But you have seen some of the Republicans express quite a lot of support, at least in these early days. But again, when that tension arises, they will not be afraid to clash with the president if they disagree with him.
But what is your prognosis about Trump reaction if he understands that, for example, within his party, this opposition, the judiciary is kind of will he push or will he make a step back?
No doubt. I mean, we've already seen, and some of them are quite scared of the fact that he uses Twitter, and we always say the president has a bully pulpit. The president has an ability to speak out that the 535 members of Congress don't have. And any one of them doesn't have quite the star power of the president. So I think we will see him push back, as we've seen insult, whether it's judges or specific members of Congress. There's no, I think, expectation that Trump will start to moderate his feelings or his comments.
I would suspect that for them, the most important thing, though, is whether or not they're going to get themselves reelected. So they're less afraid of Trump saying something nasty about them than they are about losing their next election. And one of the concerns they have right now is that if they go against Trump and they lose his base as their voters and they lose the election, then they've lost. But if they start to feel that the people are turning against Trump, they're happy to go against him because it will help them get reelected.
Jeffrey?
I was just going to point out that I think it's important to keep in mind that in the American electoral system, there is this separation between the legislative and the executive branch. So the president doesn't get to determine who gets to run for Congress from the Republican Party. There's a primary process within each state, within each congressional district, where the candidates compete among themselves for votes. And the president can weigh in, he can support one candidate or the other, but he doesn't have the final say in terms of who's going to be on the ticket.
Let me ask again, maybe to finalize this part, what can be other factors that can limit Trump's ambitions? Is it media? Is it protests? Is it human rights activists protecting immigrants? Who?
All of these factors. I mean, he's clearly very sensitive to criticism in the media. At the end of the day, we have to remember, in the United States, the public drives public policy. So these members of Congress will decide whether to confront him based on what they're hearing from their constituents at home. But he may also be checked by the reaction of international leaders. We've seen him articulate a very different position today on China, the one China policy, than he had before, in part because I think there were growing signs that the relationship there was at risk, that he didn't want a strained relationship
That's
with China
a chapter we move to. In the next chapter, maybe some internal factors, other?
I think one other thing that it's worth pointing out is that even within the executive branch, there's a career civil service that often operates according to its own internal rules. So, for example, when Trump issued the immigration order, there was a dissent cable signed by over 1,000 career civil servants in the State Department that objected to that decision. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't be forced to implement it, but obviously if it's a position that they don't support, they're going to be less enthusiastic about implementing it. They're going to try and slow roll implementation. They're going to leak information that's unfavorable to the administration, and we've already seen quite a bit of leaking.
Alexandra?
I think also you can't underestimate the impact of the large protests that have taken place, the women's protests that were run outside of the White House and in many other cities the day after the inauguration obviously touched Trump with their size, which was by most accounts larger than the inauguration. We've also seen big protests at airports in reaction to the Muslim ban, and one can't help but think that that's also influencing him. For someone who's very keen to have popular support, seeing big demonstrations like that can be very disturbing.
And one other potentially very important factor is the business community. The American business community reacted very strongly, including technology companies, to the immigration ban. But if Trump sees himself as a businessman, but if the business community starts to rebel and really speak out against his policies, if the stock market starts to suffer, we could see a shift there where there will be a real check from the business side.
That's very interesting, and we see all these factors that can influence France. But let's talk about also international politics. That will be another chapter, the next chapter. Stay on Hromadske and come back to the minute. We're coming back to the studio, Hromadske, and we continue to discuss the situation of Donald Trump and the factors that can influence his decisions. Now let's move to international scene, and we see also that there are limits of Trump's, activities and Trump's power. For example, the factors of China, Israel, Middle East, Iran, Russia, etc. What do you think are the most important, Alexandra?
I'm not sure that we've actually seen the limits to his power yet. On the one hand, he hasn't tried to do anything concrete. There have been a lot of pronouncements and phone calls, but there haven't been major policies, if we exclude the immigration ban as being primarily domestic. But I do think that we are seeing that he is sensitive to how international leaders are reacting to him, particularly in Europe, and I think we can expect him to be very sensitive to the pushback that he gets on some of his policies, especially from allies.
Europe is very interesting because his first meeting was with Theresa May, as far as I remember, but let's talk a little bit on Middle East, about Israel. Jeffrey, we know that next week there will be a meeting between Trump and Netanyahu. What is to be expected in these relations?
Well, I think in the first meeting between heads of state or heads of government, a lot of it is to communicate what the basic line of policy is going to be and to establish the relationship. With Netanyahu, there's going to be some tension over statements that have been made about settlements in the West Bank, because initially the Trump team seemed to indicate that they were open to expansion of Israeli settlements, but then subsequently criticized Netanyahu when a decision was made to proceed with a large growth of settlements outside of one of the existing blocks. So I think the Israelis are still trying to kind of figure out where Trump is going to be on that issue.
How would you locate, Jeffrey and David, how would you locate Trump's policy, Trump's ambitions in the Middle East? Is it coming back to the traditional Republican, friendship with Israel, but then opposition to Iran and maybe to other states?
Well, we've seen initial expressions of very strong support for Israel, but again, some conflicting statements on settlements. Certainly his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is expected to play a role there. We've gotten one message, which is that Trump sees himself as somebody who might be able to help bring a solution to that long conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. On the other hand, he's someone who said he wants to focus at home and pull back. I think we have seen that he is influenced by people around him, including not just his son-in-law, but there was a conversation that he had with King Abdullah of Jordan that seemed to change the tone on settlements at one point, that in fact who he's speaking to at a given moment may be changing his mind as he figures out what his foreign policy is.
What about Europe? We talked about a little bit. What is the influence of Europe, and which leader can influence most? Is it May, or is it Merkel, or is it French leader? What do you think?
Well, one of the things that we have seen on foreign policy is that it doesn't look like Donald Trump's been thinking very deeply about a lot of the issues for a long time. So he's in a learning process, and he's learning a lot from the people that he's spoken to and from those who are giving him feedback around him. I would guess that at least at first he will find Theresa May the easiest person to speak to, because he supports Brexit and because there's a natural language affinity there. He does not seem to be particularly responsive to Angela Merkel so far, but we're really going to have to wait and see. He hasn't been particularly Euro-friendly, apparently because of some of the experiences he had with regulation when he was building his golf courses.
But what about Russia? I mean, let's come back to come to this issue in these mosaics of Middle East and Europe. For example, we clearly see the difference of views vis-à-vis Israel, vis-à-vis Iran, and vis-à-vis Syria. So, do you think it will make an obstacle for Trump-Putin deal, David?
Well, this is obviously one of the most sensitive issues facing the new president, because during the election there was a portrayal of him as close to Putin, of Russia as supporting Trump, interfering in the election, hacking the election. So the administration will be treading, very carefully, I think, in the days ahead. It's hard to know what to expect. Will there continue to be this, what they call bromance between Putin and Trump, or will he realize that this is a very dangerous relationship, if only because there are Republicans in Congress, John McCain, you named one, who are very apprehensive, wary, if you will, about Russia. So again, I think that learning process is going on, and we're seeing on whether it's on Europe. I mean, he does support Brexit. He met with Theresa May. At the same time, he'll find out that the rest of the EU economically is much more important to the United States than the UK. When you start to put the numbers to where the ideas are, some of them don't match up. Yes, there's the special relationship, but again, he sees himself as a businessman, and the dollars and the euros add up differently.
What about NATO, Jeffrey? What do you think? Because first there was a statement that America should, go away from NATO, but then there was a support of NATO.
Well, what was initially said by Trump was that he thought NATO was obsolete, and that he felt that allies weren't paying enough for the security guarantees that the United States was providing. And I should say that Trump may have expressed it in a kind of rude way, but that's a longstanding complaint that American leaders have had, that Europeans benefit from the American security umbrella without paying their fair share. So in some sense, I see this as being a kind of extreme version of what's been a longstanding American frustration. Obviously, how the relationship with Putin and how policy towards Russia develops is going to say a lot about where Trump comes down on the utility of NATO, also the extent to which NATO can be brought to bear on the challenges in the Middle East, specifically dealing with the Islamic State, which has been another high priority for Trump and the people around him since the campaign.
But what if we look at the chessboard, can we just make some prognosis? For example, if Trump is tough on Iran, will it make friendship with Putin harder, or if he is too friendly with Israel, or if he continues to oppose Assad regime? What is to follow?
Well, we know that all these relationships are interconnected, right? That if you're supportive of Israel, you may have problems with the Arab states most immediately. The tension with increased tension with Iran runs the risk not only of complicating things with Russia, but with the other allies in Europe who were part of the agreement on Iran's nuclear program. I mean, the European partners have been clear they have no intention of undoing and unwinding that deal, even if Trump tries to retreat from there. So you have all these interconnected relationships, any one of which could affect the others. On NATO, he not only said it was obsolete, but he really rattled folks at headquarters in Brussels when he suggested that maybe the United States wouldn't honor the commitment in the NATO treaty to collective defense. Now, he's sort of backed up on that as the allies have tried to remind him that the only time that Article 5 was invoked was after the terrorist attack on 9/11 on the U.S. But again, everybody is quite nervous about where he may be going and what each peace means for every other relationship.
Alexandra, do we have some clue of where he will go, or is it just completely unknown? What do you think?
I think it's largely unknown. We have clues, but we don't know which of them are going to ultimately prove to be correct. I don't think that we're looking at a president who's come in with a vision of what the world should look like, apart from that he wants to concentrate on domestic politics. And as a result of that priority, he's really not spent the time with people who could help him to put together a comprehensive worldview with priorities. I think he will learn on the job. He's obviously someone who prides himself on assimilating information quickly, but it's going to take a while for him to not only formulate specific policies for individual countries, but also ideas of how those different countries fit together.
Jeffrey, do you think that Trump in the foreign policy has red lines, so something which he cannot go beyond?
I imagine that he probably does, and I think there are some consistent lines that we've seen from the way that he's talked throughout the campaign up until the present. He's clearly hostile to free trade as it's been pursued over the last couple of decades. He clearly sees Islamist extremism and terrorism as being top-order security challenges that the United States needs to pay more attention to. I think he sees having a good relationship with Russia as being something that is in the United States' interest. Now, the question really comes, as he's pursuing these different objectives, to what extent they can be made to be compatible with all of the other things that are important to the United States as well, and how these different issues fit together.
Thank you very much. I think we'll wrap up with the second block with this international context, and we will, in the next chapter, we will come back to the issues that are of interest of all Ukrainians. What is the position vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine? Stay on Hromadske. We're coming back to the studio of Hromadske, and we continue to discuss Donald Trump's policies and the factors that can limit his ambitions or his promises. And now we're talking about Eastern Europe, about Ukraine and Russia. And my first question to you, we know the scandal with intelligence services and the reports submitted by intelligence services about Russian role in hacking the election. What do you think of it and how Trump reacted? Alexandra.
Well, I don't think we have any evidence that the actual election voting itself was hacked. So the question is whether or not the Russians used propaganda to somehow influence the outcome of the election by discrediting Hillary Clinton. It's impossible to say whether or not that would have made any difference in the election, but it does appear that there were at least attempts at interference, certainly with the Democratic National Committee. I think that Trump is very concerned that he be seen as less than fully legitimate. That's why he's been so concerned with the fact that the popular vote was not in his favor. But I suspect it's something that we're going to move away from pretty quickly now that we've got other problems to deal with.
But do you think, Jeffrey, do you think that this is a factor that influences right now American politics? I mean, is this issue of Russian interference raises often in American discussions?
Yeah, I think it is still a pretty important issue. I mean, it's being raised by opponents of Trump to question the legitimacy of the election that brought him to power. And I think, as Alexandra said, Trump is trying to defend himself from those allegations. But, you know, that said, there's a number of investigations going on. There's one being conducted by the Intelligence Committee. There's one being conducted by a Senate committee. There are a couple of others. So at some point, we're going to have more information in the public domain about what did and didn't transpire. And hopefully, at that point, enough will have happened that we'll be able to sort of know the story and then be able to move on and deal with other issues.
David, but Trump is circled, if I may say, by the people who are friendly with Russia. I mean, we know Stephen Bannon, for example. We know some other people. Do you think their influence on him is important?
Well, there's no question they have very strong influence, but this issue I don't think is going away so fast. And part of it is because Trump's comments, his unconventional statements, have made it okay for Democrats in the opposition to now raise criticism or allegations that would otherwise have been unthinkable in American politics. Nancy Pelosi, the leader of the Democrats in the House of Representatives, asking out loud, is Russia blackmailing the President of the United States? I mean, that would have been seen as something that was out of bounds to raise that question about the President. But in fact, it's a question that she's raised, and other members of Congress, including Republicans, are demanding full investigations into what happened during the election and what was the extent of that hacking. So while Trump and his advisors seem open to a different type of relationship with Putin and with Putin's Russia, it's not clear that they'll be able to get there so quickly without running into a lot of political trouble at home. And that's their first concern.
Do you think that basically, Jeffrey, Alexander, do you think that he's reacting by making a step back, saying, well, look, I don't know what will be the relations with Putin, etc.?
Well, I think, as David said, the fact that there is so much public uproar over the potential Russian role in the election, that Trump has been forced to be a little bit cautious in terms of how he's pursuing this idea of a rapprochement with Russia. I think, you know, over the longer term, we'll see what happens. We'll see how much this remains in the public eye. But in terms of the things that are actually acting as checks on Trump's decision making, I think actually this is going to be one of them. He can't be seen as being overly solicitous of Russia, because then it will stir up again all of these questions about how did he.
But imagine, for example, there is more
elected.
information about Russian engagement, and what consequences can he face? For example, can he face impeachment or other things? What do you think?
Well, we're a long way from, I think, any kind of impeachment question. I mean, this is very early in the presidency. It's obviously not out of the question. We've seen President Clinton impeached in our lifetimes. But I think first, you know, you see Trump again evolving on these issues, changing some of the things he said. He has now come out and said that the annexation of Crimea was illegal. I think he's figuring out where Ukraine is, where Crimea is, where the border is, where the conflict is taking place. I think he's obviously learned very quickly who Yulia Tymoshenko is, and had a phone call now with President Poroshenko. It's a moment where there's a lot of information obviously coming at him, a lot of issues that seem to be new for him. And as you know, Ukrainian politics can be complicated for even those of us who follow it closely. So for folks who haven't followed it as closely, you can imagine how much learning.
Let's come back to Ukraine, but let me ask a question which is, of course, very important: sanctions. Alexandra, what do you think? Because we know that there is a phone talk between Trump and Putin, and maybe Putin was disappointed because he had no guarantee of lifting the sanctions. What is that? What is the game behind?
Well, I think one of the things that Trump has discovered is that it's not so easy for him to lift sanctions. I mean, there are some that he can do automatically with an executive order, but there are others that are in place through Congress. And Congress is now talking about solidifying the ones that he would have been able to lift himself by passing legislation.
Do you think it's realistic that the Congress passes the legislation to solidify this?
I do think it's realistic.
Mm-hmm. So the McCain statements that are basically
I don't think it's because of McCain's statements. I don't think it's because of McCain. I think there is a fundamental mistrust of Russia in the American Congress that runs much deeper than it does through Trump. And if they fear that he's likely to give in to Russia, they might come up and decide that Congress has to take a stand here.
So what's your prognosis? Can we forecast something? Does it mean that Trump is not going to lift sanctions anytime soon in the immediate future, Jeffrey?
I think it's very hard to predict what Trump is or is not going to do. He's proven himself to be very malleable, to say different things to different people at different times. And on Russia policy in particular, it's clear he's listening to a lot of different voices. The people in his inner circle who focus on Russia issues, some of them are very pro-Russian or very pro having a good relationship with Russia, people like General Flynn and Bannon, whom you mentioned, whereas others, General Mattis, even Secretary Tillerson, have come out and said much stronger things about the need to push back against Russian aggression. And so I don't think we know at this point where Trump is going to come down as his advisors are telling him these different things.
But remember, this is a president who has made clear that he thinks his predecessor was too weak and wasn't demanding enough from adversaries, but also not demanding enough from allies, that they don't spend enough on the NATO alliance and the defense. So for him to lift sanctions and not get anything from Russia in return, I think would be unthinkable. That would make him look weak. And the question is, what is Vladimir Putin willing to give in return for the lifting of those sanctions? Also, the United States and Europe have been unified on sanctions until now, but it doesn't mean that unity has to continue. If the U.S. lifts, we saw the Danish foreign minister telling me in Brussels the other day that, in Denmark, there's quite a lot of support for maintaining sanctions. So you may see Europe in one place and the United States in another.
But coming back to Putin's possible concessions, what can it be? Because Trump hopes that Putin will help him fight ISIS. Is it realistic?
Well, I don't think the experience in Syria has been very encouraging, to tell you the truth. I think that there have been fundamentally different understandings of what the risk is. Now, it does look like there's a more consolidated opinion that ISIS should be the priority, but I would be surprised if that were as easy to achieve as Trump has been declaring.
What about this Yalta talk? New Yalta, let's revise the Helsinki order. What do you think? Is it just a bluff, or there are some signs that it can happen?
I think there are some folks who like the idea of going back to this sort of great game, but I think Putin has worked very hard, and we've seen obviously the human toll in Donbass, to make Crimea non-negotiable. So whatever compromise might involve Donetsk and Luhansk, but that Crimea is off the table. I'm not sure that the West and even Trump will go for that. That even if they get into some sort of Yalta Conference, I don't think Trump, again, the way he sees himself and perceives himself as a businessman, that he would just say, oh yeah, forget about Crimea. That's yours. That's okay. We'll talk about where the lines are in the East. So I think it's a little far-fetched. I don't know that in the multilateral world we live in that Angela Merkel would necessarily stand by and let Trump and Putin just decide things for everybody. It depends what that group looked like.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I mean, the Yalta Conference happened at a time when a lot of Europe was under military occupation, and certainly the areas that ended up in the Soviet zone were mostly those where the Red Army was present. I think today the world, and Europe in particular, is much more multilateral, and you can't really envision Putin and Trump sitting down at a table and deciding where they're going to draw lines, and then leadership in Ukraine, Poland, never mind Germany and France going along with that, and they get a voice in this too.
What about Ukraine? Maybe the last question, so we'll finish with the Ukrainian question. What to expect from Trump's policy to Ukraine? What do you think?
I suspect that Trump doesn't have a policy on Ukraine yet. I think that he's been hearing a lot of voices telling him that Russian aggression is a serious problem, starting with the Crimean annexation, but also the continuation of the conflict in the East. And I think it's been made important enough that he's going to have to think about it, and think about it when he's dealing with Russia.
Jeffrey?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. During the campaign, obviously, the effort to promote a good relationship with Russia came at the expense of a focus on Ukraine, and mostly it was the absence of discussion about Ukraine that was notable during the campaign. I think now that Trump is in power and is meeting with people like Tymoshenko and is actually learning about what's at stake in Ukraine, some of the things that he thought might be possible when he was just talking in sort of empty rhetorical terms are proving to be much harder, and that reality is going to act as a constraint specifically on Ukraine and the sanctions, but more generally in terms of his approach to Russia.
David?
I think it depends on how successful President Poroshenko is in reaching out and how willing Trump is to listen. Will Poroshenko convince him to come here? We know he won't drink vodka, but maybe Trump will try some sala and Ukrainsky borscht and go to the banya. And we hear some reports of him in his bathrobe. Will they be able to sit down together, him and Poroshenko?
What can be Ukrainian arguments? I mean, why does Trump need Ukraine? Because I mean, it's obvious that he might need Russia because of the economic interests. Whatever.
Well, we know one of the arguments will be that there need to be rules, right? That the international order needs to be respected, and that if Russia is acting unilaterally, violating boundaries, that this is not only bad for Ukraine, this is bad for the United States and for the rest of the world. I mean, it will start with that. We know, of course, that Ukraine will remind President Trump of the Budapest Memorandum and giving up its nuclear arsenal and what it expects to have gotten in return, which is respect for sovereignty. One of the big questions is, for Trump, does he care about that kind of history? Or is he focused on, looking ahead toward things like building his wall with Mexico and making them pay for it, as opposed to worrying about what's happening.
What about some Ukrainian friends of Trump, like Saakashvili, for example? Can they influence?
It's possible. We don't know. Again, I think Trump listens to advice from all kinds of quarters, including some that one would not traditionally think of a president getting advice from. I would just add one other thing, though, if I could. We haven't talked at all about China, but one of the things that Trump has focused on quite a bit is China, and it seems that he wants to lead the United States into a more confrontational relationship with China, certainly on the question of trade, possibly on the issue of Taiwan. And this issue of territorial integrity and rules, I think, becomes really important when you think about it in the context of the U.S.-China relationship. So if Trump says it's okay for Russia to unilaterally change borders in Eastern Europe, that makes it much harder for him to make the opposite case about China potentially changing the status quo in the South China Sea or going after Taiwan. So I think having this consistency and seeing the connections between all of these different issues is something that it's going to take time for him to develop.
And one thing we've seen is that American interest in Ukraine has often been, and the relationship with Russia is often driven by other factors. Syria was much more important in the Russia-America dialogue. China may be a bigger factor. Iran may be a bigger factor. So that because of the absence of major U.S. economic interest here, Ukraine does have that challenge of convincing Trump why it's important to focus on the Russia relationship in the context of Ukraine, or the Ukraine relationship in that context, as opposed to these other relationships like China that are much more.
Alexandra, what can be Ukrainian arguments? For example, should we pose these analogies with China, within Balkans, whatever?
Well, I think Ukraine should be making all the arguments it can. One of the things that we heard earlier today, which is quite interesting, is that Ukraine is really on the front line of the conflict with Russia. That if the United States is interested in matching Russia, at least as a great power, and that's certainly what Russia would like us to be thinking, that the way that Russian military technology is being used in Ukraine and in Syria gives us an opportunity to understand how it's developed and how it's evolved. In addition, the way that Ukraine's been fighting the hybrid war and to some extent cyber attacks gives us some information and some knowledge about what techniques are being used. And so it might be that the Ukrainians can make an argument that they have information about how this conflict is evolving, which could be of direct interest to the United States.
That's very interesting, but we'll probably finish this program. Thank you so much for this very interesting talk. I think we have drawn a very wide and multidimensional picture. So we were discussing American politics, we were discussing Trump, and I remind that we had David Herszenhorn from Politico, Alexandra Vacroux from Davis Center at Harvard University, and Jeffrey Manko from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I say goodbye to you. Stay on Hromadske.
Сергій Жадан – один з найвідоміших українських письменників. Крім того, волонтер, музикант, а відтепер і засновник благодійного фонду в гостях на Громадському. Вітаю, Сергію. Днями вже з'явилося офіційне повідомлення про реєстрацію такого фонду. Очевидно, ідея його створити з'явилася раніше. Але фактично от ті виклики і ті проблеми, на вирішення яких спрямоване створення фонду, ти з ними працюєш не перший рік, фактично від початку конфлікту.